Ilara felt the inheritance not as a gift, but as a final, quiet insult. The lawyer, a man with a face like worn leather and eyes that offered no comfort, had slid the deed across the polished expanse of his desk. It was a single sheet of paper, brittle and yellowed at the folds, representing the sum total of what her late husband, Thomas, had left her. Not the small savings they had spoken of, not the life insurance policy he had sworn was filed away, but this, a deed for a parcel of land in a state she had never visited, a place whose name tasted of dust and endings. The official description was clinical, a long, thin rectangle of acreage in the high desert, but the lawyer's verbal summary was far more descriptive. He called it, with a small, pitying sigh, unbuildable. A sliver of scree and rock pressed against the sheer face of what the locals called the Red Canyon. It was, he had explained, a tax property Thomas had bought in an online auction for a pittance years ago, likely as a foolish, romantic notion of owning a piece of the untamed West. It possessed no water rights, no road access to speak of, and a gradient that made it more of a cliffside rubble pile than actual land. It was worthless, and it was all she had. The bus ride west was a pilgrimage into desolation. Green dwindled, then vanished, replaced by the unrelenting ochre and rust of the high desert. The sky grew vast and empty, a pale, unforgiving blue that seemed to pull the moisture from her very skin. When the driver finally called out the name of her stop, a town that was little more than a gas station and a handful of weathered buildings huddled against the wind, she stepped out into a world that felt alien. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something ancient and mineral. She had one suitcase, containing all that remained of her former life, and the deed, folded carefully in her coat pocket. It felt less like a document of ownership and more like a sentence. Her world had shrunk from a comfortable two-bedroom house with a garden to the contents of this single bag and a piece of paper that promised only rock and sky. The grief for Thomas was a constant physical weight in her chest, but here, under the immense, silent pressure of the open landscape, it was joined by a new and terrifying companion, a profound sense of insignificance. She was a ghost in a land that did not care for ghosts. The man at the hardware store was named Silas. He was built like the stunted junipers that clung to the hillsides, compact, tough, and weathered into deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He looked at her city coat and the suitcase by her feet, and seemed to understand her entire story in a single sweeping glance. She asked for directions to the parcel of land, her voice sounding thin and foreign in the dusty, quiet store that smelled of oil and metal. He took the deed from her, his calloused thumb tracing the faded ink. A flicker of something, pity perhaps, or a dark amusement, crossed his face. "Coyote's Tooth," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That's what we call this strip. Belonged to the county for 50 years before your husband bought it. Nobody ever wanted it." He gave her directions that were simple and bleak. Follow the main road until it turned to dirt, then follow the dirt road until it became 2 ruts in the sand, and when the ruts disappeared, she was to walk toward the canyon wall. "Can't miss it," he'd concluded, handing the deed back. "It's the part nobody was foolish enough to claim." He sold her a canvas tarp, a shovel, and a heavy wool blanket on a credit she knew she could not pay, his gesture a mixture of small-town kindness and a grim certainty that he would never see the money. The walk was longer than she had anticipated, a brutal trek under a sun that felt less like warmth and more like a physical weight. The land was exactly as described. The road dissolved into a wash of gravel and sand, and ahead, the Red Canyon rose like a fortress wall, a magnificent cruel gash in the earth. Her parcel, Coyote's Tooth, was a steep, unstable slope of shattered rock and sun-baked dirt, clinging to the base of the vertical cliff face. It was less a piece of land and more the geological debris left over after the world was made. To build anything here was laughable. The ground was too steep, the rock too friable. A strong rain would wash any structure into the wash below. A tent would be shredded by the wind that funneled through the canyon. Alara sank onto a flat-topped boulder, the shovel and tarp lying useless beside her. The scale of her ruin was absolute. The lawyer was right. Silas was right. The land was a sentence, and this was her prison cell. A cell with no walls and no ceiling. Only the mocking emptiness of the sky above, and the indifferent stone at her back. She sat there for hours as the sun arced across the sky, watching the light change on the canyon wall, the reds deepening to purples and then to a soft bruised gray in the twilight. For the first time since Thomas's death, she did not cry. Her sorrow was too vast, too dry for tears. It simply existed, a landscape unto itself, as barren and as hopeless as the one before her. The first few weeks were a blur of grim survival. She used the tarp to create a crude lean-to against the flattest section of rock she could find, securing it with stones. It was a miserable shelter, flapping violently in the wind and offering little protection from the cold that descended with the sun each evening. The nights were the hardest. The temperature plummeted, and the desert, so silent by day, came alive with the scuttling of unseen creatures and the lonely cry of a distant coyote. She ate sparingly from the small supply of dried goods she had purchased, her meager funds dwindling with each passing day. She spent her days exploring the narrow confines of her property, a pointless exercise in confirming its uselessness. The land was a geology lesson in failure. Shale that crumbled in her hand, sandstone that turned to grit, and the hard, unyielding granite of the canyon wall itself. The townspeople, on her rare trips for water and supplies, treated her with a cautious distance. They saw the dust in her hair, the new hard lines forming on her face, and the desperation in her eyes. They called her the Canyon Woman, a name spoken in whispers, a local folktale of madness and sorrow in the making. She was a problem they did not know how to solve, and so they mostly chose to ignore her. One afternoon in late autumn, the sky, which had been a clear, sharp blue for weeks, turned the color of old pewter. A wind rose from the north, carrying the first real bite of the coming winter. It was a predatory wind, one that seemed to search out every gap in her clothing, every flaw in her pathetic shelter. It tore at the tarp, threatening to rip it from its stone anchors. Huddling for protection, Alara pressed herself into a shallow alcove in the canyon wall, a place where the rock was concave, offering a slight reprieve. The wind howled past the opening, but in the small hollow the air was strangely still and warm. It was a peculiar warmth, not the heat of the sun, but something deeper, something that seemed to be radiating from the rock itself. She placed her bare palm against the granite. It was cool to the touch, of course, but it lacked the biting, aggressive cold of the air. It felt stable. It felt like substance. While the world outside was being stripped of its heat by the ferocious wind, the great mass of the canyon wall seemed to hold on to a reserve of energy, a deep, ancient memory of the summer sun. A thought, faint as a ghost, began to form in her mind. It was a memory of her father, a geologist who spoke of rocks as if they were living things. He had once explained the concept of thermal mass to her as a child. He'd likened a great stone to a battery, one that charges slowly in the heat and discharges just as slowly in the cold. A stone house, he'd said, stays cool on a summer afternoon and warm on a winter night. The bigger the stone, the more energy it can hold. Alara looked at the canyon wall, a sheer, solid face of granite that stretched for miles in either direction and rose 1,000 feet into the sky. It was not just a stone. It was perhaps one of the largest stones on the continent. It was a battery of unimaginable capacity, charged by 100 million desert suns. The people of the town built their houses of wood and plasterboard, structures that stood alone on the flatlands, fighting the wind and the cold. They built against the environment. But what if one didn't fight it? What if one joined it? What if a shelter wasn't built on the worthless land, but into it, wedged against the one thing of immense value she possessed? The thermal battery of the canyon wall. The idea was absurd. It was the logic of a desperate mind. But it was also the only idea she had. It took root in the barren soil of her hopelessness and began to grow. She would not build a house. She would build a wedge, a structure with 3 walls and a roof, with the 4th wall being the living rock of the canyon. She would dig into the scree slope, creating a level platform, and in doing so, she would sink the floor of her shelter below the frost line, borrowing the Earth's stable temperature from below, just as she would borrow the rock's stored warmth from behind. The plan was audacious, born of a whisper of half-remembered science and the stark reality of her impending death from exposure. The first snows were not far off. She had no time for doubt. She had only time for work. The next day, she walked into town and went to Silas's hardware store. The bell above the door chimed, announcing her dusty, disheveled presence. Silas looked up from behind the counter, his expression unreadable. She did not ask for more credit. She offered him the only thing she had of value, a thin gold wedding band. She placed it on the counter between them. "I need a pickaxe, a better shovel, and a wheelbarrow," she said, her voice steady. "And advice." Silas looked at the ring, then back at her face. He saw not madness, but a terrifying crystalline clarity. He pushed the ring back across the counter. "Keep your ring, woman," he grumbled, turning away to hide a flicker of something that might have been respect. "Your credit is good for now. What foolishness are you planning now?" She explained her idea, simply and without embellishment. She spoke of thermal mass, of the rock as a heat sink, of digging into the earth. He listened, his head cocked, his expression a mixture of disbelief and professional curiosity. When she was finished, he was silent for a long time. "You'll dig your own grave," he said finally. It was not a judgment, but a statement of practical fact. "That rock will sweat in the summer and bleed cold in the winter. You're talking about living in a root cellar." "A root cellar doesn't freeze," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. He shook his head slowly, a grim smile touching his lips. "I'll sell you the tools," he said. "But I want you to understand that I'm selling them to a woman who is actively trying to bury herself alive." The work was a brutal catechism of pain. Her body, soft from a life of books and quiet contemplation, rebelled. The pickaxe felt impossibly heavy, a clumsy extension of her will that left her hands blistered and bleeding within the first hour. The scree slope was a torment of loose rock and sliding dirt. For every shovelful she moved, it seemed another half slid back down to mock her. The wheelbarrow, a rusty squealing contraption, was her tormentor. Pushing it uphill on the unstable ground was a battle that left her gasping for air, her muscles screaming in protest. At the end of the first day, she had managed to clear a space barely large enough to lie down in. She collapsed in her tarp shelter, her body a single throbbing ache, and wept from sheer exhaustion and the monumental scale of the task she had set for herself. It was impossible. She was a fool. Silas was right. The whole town was right. But the next morning she rose with the sun, every muscle protesting, and she went back to work. A strange, stubborn resolve had taken hold. The physical pain was a distraction from the deeper pain of her grief. The rhythm of the work, the swing of the pick, the scrape of the shovel, the squeal of the wheel, became a kind of meditation. She was not just moving rock and dirt. She was carving out a space to exist, fighting back against the emptiness that threatened to consume her. She learned the language of the earth. She learned how to read the layers of sediment, how to pry loose the stubborn embedded boulders, how to use gravity as an ally, sending cascades of rock tumbling down to the base of the slope. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and hard. The sun browned her skin, and the wind whipped her hair into a permanent tangle. She grew thin, but it was the thinness of a whipcord. taut with a new and unfamiliar strength. She was no longer the canyon woman, the object of pity. She was becoming something else, something forged in the crucible of her own desperate labor. As autumn deepened, her pit grew. She had carved a level platform 10 feet deep and 15 feet wide into the slope, a raw red wound in the earth against the gray granite of the canyon wall. The work had revealed the true nature of the rock face. It was not perfectly flat, but textured with fissures and ledges, a geography of its own. She had chosen a spot where a slight overhang would provide a natural roof for the first few feet of her shelter, a gift from the stone itself. Silas began to make trips out to her site, ostensibly to check on the tools she had bought, but really, she knew, to witness the progress of her madness. He would stand at the edge of her excavation, shaking his head, a thermos of coffee in his hand. "You've moved a mountain," he'd say, his voice laced with a grudging admiration. "But you're still just digging a hole." He offered practical advice, pointing out a vein of clay she could use to mortar stones, showing her how to brace the dirt walls to prevent a collapse. He never once said he believed in her plan, but his actions betrayed a growing investment in her survival. He was her only link to the world of men, a skeptical chorus of one. With the platform dug, the construction began. She had no money for lumber, so she became a scavenger. She walked for miles along the dirt roads, collecting the discarded skeletons of old fences, weathered gray posts of juniper and pine that were hard as iron. She found a derelict homesteader's cabin miles down the canyon, its roof long collapsed, and spent a week painstakingly dismantling it, salvaging every nail, every plank, every precious pane of glass from its single, shattered window. She hauled the materials back to her site, one grueling wheelbarrow load at a time. It was a slow, painstaking process. She was building her house out of the failures and refuse of others, a testament to the stubborn persistence of life. She used the largest stones she had excavated to build up 2 side walls, mortaring them with the clay Silas had pointed out, mixed with water she hauled from the town well. The front wall was a patchwork of salvaged planks and the one precious window, positioned to catch the morning sun. The roof was the greatest challenge. A sloping structure of scavenged timbers covered with layers of tarp, oilcloth, and finally, a thick layer of sod and earth she painstakingly carried up from the wash below. It was a living roof, designed to insulate and to blend her strange dwelling into the landscape. By the time the first snow flurries began to dance in the air, her shelter was complete. It was a strange, half-buried thing, more a part of the landscape than a structure upon it. From a distance, it was nearly invisible, a slight hump of earth pressed against the vastness of the canyon wall. Inside, it was small and dark, smelling of damp earth, clay, and old wood. It was a burrow, a den. It was a tomb, as Silas had predicted. Or it was a womb. She had not yet decided which. She had built a small, efficient stove from an old oil drum she had found, venting it through a narrow fissure in the rock above. A small pile of scavenged juniper wood, gnarled and dense, was stacked neatly against one wall. It was all she had to face the coming winter. The whispers in town had grown louder. They said the canyon woman had buried herself, that she had finally succumbed to her grief and dug her own grave. The distant relative of her husband, a man named Marcus, who had contested the will initially, even drove out from the city. He stood at the edge of her property, a fleshy man in a clean suit, and stared at her hovel with undisguised contempt. He called it a savage's den and threatened to have her declared incompetent. She had simply looked at him with her clear, steady eyes, a shovel in her calloused hands, and said nothing. He had eventually left, unnerved by her silence and her self-possession. She was no longer a victim he could intimidate. The winter did not arrive gently. It descended like a hammer blow. One night the temperature dropped 30 degrees, and the world awoke to a landscape transformed, buried under a foot of fine, dry snow. The wind began to howl, a constant mournful shriek that scoured the land, piling the snow into massive drifts. For Alara, the first test had come. She lit a small fire in her oil drum stove, the little bit of wood a pathetic offering against the immense cold. She sat wrapped in her blanket, listening to the storm rage outside, and waited. The air inside the shelter was cool, but it was not the biting, life-stealing cold she had known in her tarp lean-to. The packed earth floor was cold underfoot, but it was a neutral cold, the stable 50-degree temperature of the deep earth. The front wall with its single window was the weak point, radiating a chill that she could feel from across the small room. But the back wall, the great granite face of the canyon, was her silent, powerful ally. It was not warm to the touch, but it was not cold either. It was a vast, neutral presence that seemed to be actively repelling the chill, pushing it back, refusing to let the ferocity of the storm penetrate her small sanctuary. The storm raged for 3 days, a relentless assault of wind and snow. The temperature outside plunged to 20 below zero, then 30. In town, it was a catastrophe. The power grid, fragile and exposed, failed on the first night. Houses built of wood and insulation, designed for milder winters, became iceboxes. Pipes froze and burst. People huddled in their homes, burning furniture to stay warm, their stockpiles of firewood dwindling at an alarming rate. The town was cut off, the roads impassable. It was a state of emergency, a primal struggle for survival that stripped away the thin veneer of modernity. Silas, in his well-built house behind the hardware store, found himself fighting a losing battle. His generator had failed, his pipes were frozen solid, and the temperature in his living room had dropped to the point where he could see his breath. He thought of the woman in the canyon. He thought of her hole in the ground, her tomb. He imagined her frozen solid, a tragic and predictable end to her folly. And yet, a nagging thought, a professional curiosity, gnawed at him. What if her insane theory about the rock had been right? The thought was absurd, but as his own home grew colder, the absurdity seemed less and less important. Wrapped in every layer of clothing he owned, he set out into the blizzard, a desperate pilgrimage to the madwoman's den. The journey was a nightmare. The wind was a physical force, trying to knock him off his feet. The snow was waist-deep in places, and he navigated by instinct and a deep knowledge of the land. It took him 2 hours to cover the distance a truck would have driven in 15 minutes. When he finally reached the edge of her property, he could see almost nothing. Her shelter was just a snowdrift among other snowdrifts. Only a thin tendril of smoke, whipped horizontal by the wind, betrayed its location. He stumbled down the slope he had watched her dig, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a desperate, flickering hope. He expected to find a frozen tomb. He expected to have to dig her out, a grim and final act of neighborly duty. He reached the door, a crude plank affair, and pushed it open, prepared for the worst. The scene that met his eyes stopped him cold. The interior was lit by the soft, steady glow of a single kerosene lamp. Alara was sitting on a simple wooden stool, a book open in her lap. She was wearing a simple wool sweater, not even a coat. The air was not warm, not like a furnace-heated house, but it was comfortable. It was profoundly, impossibly still and quiet. The howling of the blizzard outside reduced to a distant murmur. He could feel no drafts. A small fire crackled in the oil drum stove, consuming a single, small log. The heat it produced was gentle, radiating through the small space. He looked at the thermometer she had tacked to one of the wooden support beams. It read 55 degrees. 55 degrees. While outside it was 30 below zero and a wind chill that could freeze a man solid in minutes. He looked from the thermometer to her face, his own numb with cold, his beard caked with ice. He could not comprehend it. All of his practical knowledge, all of his experience with building and weather, told him this should be impossible. A structure made of dirt and junk should be colder than the grave. How? The word was a croak, torn from his frozen throat. Ilara looked up from her book, her expression calm, unsurprised. She gestured to the massive stone wall that formed the back of her home. "The rock," she said simply. "It's breathing out summer." Silas stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and the muted roar of the storm was silenced completely. He took off his gloves, his fingers clumsy and numb, and walked to the granite wall. He pressed his palm against it. It felt cool, but it was a living coolness, not the dead, parasitic cold of the outside world. He could feel, or perhaps he only imagined he could feel, a deep, slow, infinitesimal pulse of energy radiating from it. He understood then. He saw the elegant, simple genius of her design. The earth below, the sod roof above, and the rock behind were all working in concert. A massive natural insulation system that rendered the outside world irrelevant. The small stove was not fighting the cold. It was merely topping up the stable temperature provided by the earth and stone. She had not built a house to shelter from the environment. She had built a shelter that was a part of the environment. She had not dug a tomb. She had created a womb in the heart of the mountain. He sank onto a crate, the last of his strength leaving him. He was a practical man, a man who believed in lumber and nails and proven methods. His entire worldview had been upended. This woman, this grieving, desperate outsider, had understood something about his own land that he had never even thought to consider. She had listened to the rock, and it had told her a secret. He, who had lived here his whole life, had only ever seen a worthless cliff face. She had seen a furnace, a shield, a guardian. He looked at her calm face in the lamplight, and felt a profound sense of awe. "I'll be damned," he whispered, the words steaming in the cool, still air. "You were right." It was an admission of defeat, a concession of faith, and the highest compliment he had ever paid to anyone. Ilara simply nodded and poured him a cup of hot tea from a kettle simmering on the stove. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the soft crackle of the fire and the distant muffled howl of the storm. In that small, quiet space, a new understanding was forged. The barrier between the Mad Canyon woman and the pragmatic store owner dissolved. They were simply two people, surviving a storm, sharing the warmth of a fire and a revolutionary idea. When the blizzard finally broke 3 days later, the world was a shattered, frozen landscape. The town was in a state of shock. Several of the outlying ranchers had lost entire herds of cattle. 2 elderly people had died in their homes from the cold. The damage was immense, a stark reminder of nature's power. When Silas and Ilara walked back into town, they were met with stunned disbelief. People had assumed she was dead. Her survival was a miracle. But when Silas, a man whose word was as solid as granite, began to tell the story, the disbelief slowly turned to wonder. He told them about her wedge house. He described the impossible warmth, the quiet stillness in the heart of the storm. He explained the principle of thermal mass, using his hands to describe the rock breathing out the stored heat of the sun. He spoke of her not as a madwoman, but as an innovator, a genius of desperation. At first they were skeptical. It sounded like a fever dream, a story born of the storm's delirium. But then a few of the more curious or desperate men, their own homes facing extensive repairs, made the trek out to Coyote's Tooth. They came to mock, but they stayed to learn. They saw the simple, elegant logic of the structure. They felt the profound stability of the air inside. They put their hands on the rock wall and felt the truth of it for themselves. The mockery died in their throats, replaced by a grudging, then an open, respect. Ilara, who had asked for nothing, suddenly found herself the center of attention. She answered their questions with the same quiet, methodical patience with which she had built her home. She explained how she had dug the foundation, how she had mortared the stones, how she had built the living roof. She did not boast. She simply stated the facts of her process, the logic of her survival, the perception of her and of her land shifted completely. The worthless strip of scree was now seen as a place of profound wisdom. Coyote's Tooth, the joke property, became the site of the Wedge House, a local legend. The name they had given her, the Canyon Woman, changed its meaning. It was no longer an insult, a mark of her otherness. It became a title, a sign of respect for her unique connection to the landscape. That spring, a young couple whose farmhouse had been ruined in the blizzard came to her. They asked if she would teach them how to build a wedge house of their own against a rock face on their property. She agreed, and so the idea began to spread. Over the next decade, the architectural language of the region began to change. People started to see the canyon walls not as useless, barren backdrops, but as potential assets, as sources of stability and warmth. More wedge houses began to appear, tucked into the folds of the land, their living roofs greening in the spring. Each one was different, adapted to the unique geography of its location, but they all followed the same fundamental principle Alara had discovered: work with the land, not against it. She never grew rich. That was never her goal. But she found a security that was deeper than money. She lived out her days in her small, quiet home, a respected elder in the community she had inadvertently reshaped. She became a keeper of a certain kind of knowledge, a wisdom that came not from books, but from listening to the earth, from paying attention to the subtle energies that flow through the world, and from the courage to pursue a foolish idea in the face of universal ridicule. Years later, long after she was gone, the wedge houses still stood, a testament to her legacy. They were the warmest houses in the winter and the coolest in the summer, efficient and enduring. What had started as one woman's desperate act of survival had become a community's common sense. The story of the Canyon Woman who wedged her shelter into the rock became a foundational myth of the place, a story told to children to teach them about resilience, ingenuity, and the importance of looking for value where no one else thinks to look. It served as a permanent reminder that sometimes the most profound wisdom is not found in the grand designs of men, but in the quiet, patient strength of the earth itself. The greatest treasures are often hidden not in vaults, but in the things we discard. And the most powerful shelters are sometimes built not by fighting the storm, but by learning to nestle into its heart and listen to the slow, steady breathing of the stone.